The city of Eldridge had once been a thriving place, filled with the sounds of life and progress. Now, it was a wasteland. Ruined buildings, shattered streets, and broken lights were all that remained. The air smelled of rust and decay. Reed had grown used to it. He had been scavenging the ruins for years, picking through the remains of what had once been a vibrant civilization. The humans who remained in Eldridge lived in small, isolated groups, constantly looking over their shoulders for dangers, whether it was from other humans or the strange things that roamed the streets after the war. Reed was no different. He had learned to survive. Every day was a fight. But today felt different. There was a strange stillness in the air. The usual sounds of distant fires or the screeching of scavenger vehicles were absent. Reed stopped and glanced around. Nothing. It felt like the world had paused. That's when he heard it. A soft rustle, almost like the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was coming from behind a pile of broken concrete and twisted metal. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. Cautiously, Reed stepped forward, his boots crunching on the cracked pavement. He reached into his jacket and gripped the handle of his makeshift knife. It wasn't much, but it had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. As he approached the debris, the sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. A person, or something like a person, moving. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He stopped just a few feet away and peered around the edge of the pile. And there she was. A woman, or at least what looked like a woman, standing among the trash and rubble. She was tall, with skin that shimmered in the dim light. It wasn't human skin, too smooth, too silvery. She was covered in markings that seemed to glow faintly, as if they were alive. Her face was beautiful, but not in the way Reed was used to. Her eyes were large, almost too large, with an intensity that made him feel like she was seeing right through him. Reed froze. He didn't know what to do. He had never seen anything like this before. He had heard rumors of strange beings, of alien encounters, but he had always dismissed them as stories. This was no story. This was real. And she was standing right in front of him. The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Reed's mind raced. Should he run? Should he attack? His fingers tightened around the knife. He had no idea what she was, or if she was dangerous, but he couldn't take any chances. He needed answers. He needed to understand why she was here. Then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. "Help. Me." Reed blinked, confused. The language was strange, unfamiliar. It wasn't anything he had heard before, yet somehow he could understand her. There was something about the way she said the words that made his heart ache. There was fear in her voice. It wasn't the kind of fear he had expected. It wasn't the usual fear of humans trying to survive in a broken world. It was something deeper, something older. She took a slow step toward him, her bare feet making no sound against the cracked ground. Reed held his ground, not sure if he should move or stay still. He knew one thing for sure. He was in no position to trust her, but at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to hurt her. There was something about her presence, something almost human. "I need shelter," she said again, her voice tinged with desperation. Reed hesitated. This wasn't the way he usually did things. He didn't trust anyone, especially not someone who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a ruined city. But this woman, or whatever she was, didn't look like she posed any immediate threat. She was clearly injured. Her clothes were torn, and there was a faint glow around her that seemed to flicker in and out like a failing light. Reed let go of the knife, slowly, keeping his eyes on her. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice rough from years of speaking to no one but himself. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked around, as though confused by her surroundings. I don't know. I fell." Reed frowned. "Fell? From where?" The woman seemed to struggle to find the right words. From above, she said softly, my ship, my people. We were attacked. Attacked. Reed repeated, his curiosity piqued. By who? She shook her head, her eyes clouded with what Reed could only guess was fear and confusion. I don't remember. I don't remember. Reed didn't know what to make of this. A ship. Attackers. She didn't sound like she was lying, but that didn't mean much. There were plenty of people in Eldridge who would say anything to survive, even if it wasn't true. All right, Reed said after a moment, his decision made. I'll help you, but you need to stay quiet and keep your distance. I'm not taking chances with someone I don't know. The woman nodded, her eyes widening with relief. She stepped closer to him, slowly, as if she didn't want to startle him. Reed motioned for her to follow, his instincts telling him to keep moving. Whatever she was out of place, and out of place meant trouble in this city. But he couldn't ignore the feeling deep down, the feeling that this encounter was going to change everything. Reed led the strange woman through the ruined streets, his mind racing. He didn't know what to make of her. One minute, he was alone in the wreckage, trying to find enough supplies to survive another day. The next, he was leading an alien through the rubble of a fallen city. The whole situation felt unreal, but there was no denying what he had seen. The way she had appeared from the trash, her glowing skin, the strange markings on her body, it was impossible to ignore. As they moved deeper into the city, Reed's thoughts drifted back to what she had said. I fell. From above. It didn't make any sense. Ships didn't fall from the sky every day. But something in her voice made him wonder. She didn't seem dangerous, at least not yet, and the look in her eyes, those huge, glowing eyes, spoke of fear, not malice. Reed had survived in this city long enough to know the difference. They reached an old, abandoned building, one of the few still standing in the wreckage of Eldridge. Reed had taken refuge here many times before. It was hidden enough to offer some safety from the scavengers who roamed the streets. The building had a small underground room, barely big enough for 2 people, but it would do for the night. Reed stepped inside, his boots tapping lightly on the concrete floor. The air smelled of mold and dust, but it was better than the streets. The woman, or whatever she was, stepped in after him, her bare feet making no sound. She seemed to float rather than walk, as though the weight of the world didn't touch her. Reed didn't trust her, not completely. She was an alien after all. And even if she was lost and confused, she was still a stranger in a world that had no room for strangers. But the more he watched her, the more he noticed that she didn't act like the others. She didn't seem interested in stealing from him or threatening him for resources. She was quiet, almost too quiet, as if she were waiting for something or someone. He placed his bag down on the floor and turned to face her. You hungry? He asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't have much left, but he could spare some water and maybe a little dried meat. She nodded, her eyes never leaving him. Yes, she said softly, her voice still strange, but somehow clearer than before. Thank you. Reed fumbled through his bag and pulled out a small tin of water. He handed it to her, and she drank from it without a word. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was on them. Reed couldn't help but feel a strange sympathy for her, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. He had his own problems to deal with, his own survival. So, he said after a long silence, what happened to your ship? You said you were attacked. Her eyes seemed to flash with something, a mixture of fear and sadness, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the ground, as though trying to collect her thoughts. Reed didn't push her. He knew better than to force someone to talk, especially if they were from another world. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My people, they were destroyed. We were exploring, looking for a safe place, a new home. But then they came, the others. They didn't want us here. Reed raised an eyebrow. The others? Who are the others? The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. A species, powerful. They destroy us, destroy everything we touch. We have been running for so long, hoping to find a place where we could live without fear. But it seems they always follow. Reed felt a chill run down his spine. There were stories, rumors really, about alien races fighting over the Earth. Some said they had arrived before the war, watching humanity from the shadows. Others said they had been here long before the humans even knew what space travel was. But to hear it from her, someone who had actually been in space, who had seen these things up close, made it feel all too real. "Are they still after you?" Reed asked, keeping his voice low. The woman nodded, her gaze distant. "Yes, they will not stop until we are all gone." Reed leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had imagined. The Earth had become a dumping ground for alien conflict, but now, it seemed, humanity was caught in the middle of something much darker. He had always fought to survive, but now there was something more at stake. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting a whole world. He glanced at the woman again. She wasn't just a helpless alien. She had fought. She had survived. And she was asking for his help. The question was, could he trust her? Could he trust an alien who had been hiding in the shadows, running from an enemy far more powerful than any human enemy? "So what do you want from me?" Reed asked, his tone sharp. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she seemed certain of something. "I need your help," she said. "Your people. You are strong, more than you know. Together, we can fight back. We can push them away." Reed stared at her, unsure of what to think. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about fighting back, fighting for something more than just a scrap of food or a safe place to hide. "I'm not some hero," Reed said. "I'm just trying to survive." The woman smiled slightly, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Survival is enough. For now." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Reed could feel the tension between them, the uncertainty, but also something else, something that felt like the beginning of an unlikely partnership. "I don't know about all this fighting back stuff," Reed said, rubbing his eyes. "But I do know one thing." "What's that?" she asked. "I'll help you. For now." The woman's eyes softened, and she nodded in gratitude. It was a small step, but it was a step. And for Reed, that was all he needed to begin. The days that followed were tense. Reed and Rena spent their time in the hidden building, cautiously planning their next move. Reed, ever the survivor, tried to maintain a sense of control, but the presence of the alien woman was making him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had changed forever the moment she stepped into his world. Her story, her past, everything was bigger than anything he had ever dealt with. But he didn't have much choice. Rena had no place to go, and she seemed to trust him, even though he hadn't completely earned it. As the sun set behind the broken skyline of Eldridge, Reed sat by the small window in their makeshift shelter, scanning the street below. The city, once full of life, now felt like a ghost town. The distant hum of scavenger vehicles echoed through the streets, a reminder that danger was never far away. Reed had learned to be cautious, always on the lookout for other humans who would do anything to survive. But it wasn't the humans that worried him now. It was the aliens. Rena hadn't mentioned much about her attackers since that first night. She seemed to avoid talking about them, as if the memories were too painful. But Reed wasn't foolish. He knew that the threat she had spoken of was real. The way she had looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, had told him everything he needed to know. Whoever was hunting her wasn't just some random enemy. They were powerful, dangerous, and relentless. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, pulling Reed from his thoughts. He tensed, reaching for the knife he kept by his side. But the footsteps were slow, cautious, not the hurried steps of someone trying to hide or escape. Reed's instincts screamed at him to stay alert. Something wasn't right. He motioned for Rena to stay quiet, then crept to the door. He peeked through a crack, his eyes narrowing as he saw a group of scavengers moving down the street. They were armed with makeshift weapons, crowbars, pipes, even knives. But it was their leader that caught Reed's attention. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his face, was scanning the area, his eyes sharp and calculating. Reed could tell he was no ordinary scavenger. This man was hunting something or someone. He quickly backed away from the door, his mind racing. It wasn't just a random group of scavengers. They were searching for something, and that something was likely Rena. The woman who had once been so quiet, so unsure of her surroundings, had become a target. "We need to move," Reed whispered, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here. Not with them looking for you." Rena nodded, her face pale. She didn't argue, didn't question him. She simply stood up and followed him, her movements silent as she stayed close to his side. Reed had no idea where they were going, but he couldn't stay in one place for too long. The scavengers were getting closer. They had to find a way out of the city, or at least find a place to hide until the threat passed. Reed grabbed his bag and made sure everything was packed. As he checked the door again, he saw the group of scavengers move past the building, unaware of their presence. He let out a quiet sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. Reed knew they wouldn't be gone for long. They would circle back. They always did. "We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice low but firm. Rena nodded again, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that made Reed pause. He turned to her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft. Rena hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her options. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "I can help you fight them. I know how to defend myself." Reed's eyes widened. "You? You've already done enough by staying hidden. We don't need to make things worse." But Rena shook her head. "They won't stop. Not until I'm dead. And if I'm dead, they'll come after you too. You don't have to do this alone." Reed clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to survive, to make it through one more day. But he couldn't deny what she was saying. The scavengers wouldn't give up, and if they kept moving through the city, they would eventually find them. "I don't know how much help you'll be," Reed muttered, but there was no mistaking the edge in his voice. He wasn't asking anymore. He was deciding. "We'll fight." Rena's eyes brightened, a faint smile crossing her face. "Thank you." Reed didn't smile back. He was still trying to wrap his mind around the idea of fighting back. His whole life had been about avoiding danger, staying hidden, and making sure no one noticed him. But this was different. This was something bigger than just survival. This was about standing up to an enemy that wanted to take everything, even when it seemed impossible. They moved quickly through the streets, staying in the shadows as much as possible. Reed's eyes darted around, his senses on high alert. Every broken window, every alleyway, every piece of rubble could hide a threat. The scavengers were still close, but Reed was determined to stay one step ahead. He knew these streets better than anyone. Finally, they reached a small, abandoned building, a place Reed had used as a hideout before. It wasn't much, but it had a good vantage point, a perfect place to set up a trap. He motioned for Rena to stay behind him as he climbed to the roof, carefully avoiding any noise that might attract attention. Once he was in position, he began to set up the traps he had learned to make over the years. Simple but effective, designed to slow down or injure anyone who got too close. Rena joined him on the roof, her movements swift and graceful, almost as if she belonged there. Reed watched her for a moment, surprised by how natural she seemed. She wasn't just an alien. She was a fighter. And together, they were about to face a threat that neither of them could escape alone. Reed crouched low on the roof, his eyes scanning the street below. He had set up the traps, simple ones, but effective. The scavengers wouldn't expect it. They would think it was just an abandoned building, a place to look for supplies, not a place where someone was waiting to fight back. His heart raced as he listened for the sound of footsteps, the soft creak of old metal, or the faintest rustle of movement. He had been in dangerous situations before, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a battle, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Rena stood beside him, her body tense, her eyes narrowed as she watched the street below. Unlike Reed, she seemed calm, almost too calm. It wasn't that she was fearless. She had shown fear when they first met. But there was something about her that made Reed feel like she had seen far worse than anything this city could throw at her. He couldn't help but feel a little uneasy about it. What had she been through before? What kind of battles had she fought? And what had they cost her? "We need to stay quiet," Reed whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Let them get closer. We strike when they're right beneath us." Rena nodded, but her expression didn't change. She was focused, alert, as if she were preparing for something bigger. Reed couldn't help but admire her calmness in the face of danger, even if it made him more nervous than usual. It wasn't just that she seemed to know what she was doing. It was the way she carried herself. There was power in her movements, an energy that made Reed feel like he was in the presence of someone who had faced things far worse than this. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Reed's muscles ached from the tension, but he didn't dare move. They had to stay hidden, wait for the right moment. Below, the scavengers were getting closer. He could hear their voices now, muffled but unmistakable. They were talking, arguing, their words carried by the wind. Reed glanced at Rena. She seemed to be listening more closely than he was, her head slightly tilted as if she were trying to make out something in the distance. She looked at him, and her eyes were sharp, calculating. She was ready. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the street below. "They're here." "I know it," the leader of the scavengers said, his voice gruff and impatient. "We'll search this building from top to bottom. They won't escape." Reed's grip tightened around the metal bar he had been using as a makeshift weapon. He had never been a fighter. He had always relied on stealth, on staying hidden and avoiding conflict. But now, the only option was to fight. He had made a decision, and he couldn't turn back. The scavengers started to move toward the building, their footsteps loud and confident as they approached the door. Reed's heart pounded in his chest. He exchanged one last glance with Rena. She was ready, and he could see it in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't hesitating. She had faced worse than this. As the scavengers reached the entrance, Reed gave the signal. He and Rena moved quickly, silently, dropping down from the roof to the ground below. They landed softly, their footsteps barely a sound. Reed's heart was in his throat as he crouched behind the doorway, waiting for the right moment. The leader of the scavengers stepped into the building first, his eyes scanning the dark interior. Reed held his breath, waiting for the leader to get close enough. When he was within range, Reed sprang into action. He lunged forward, his makeshift weapon striking the leader in the back, knocking him to the ground. The man cried out in surprise, but Reed didn't stop. He moved quickly, pushing the man out of the way as Rena joined the fight. She was faster than Reed had expected. Her movements were precise and controlled, almost like she had been trained for this. She didn't hesitate. She took down the second scavenger with a single strike, her body flowing like water as she disarmed him. The man stumbled backward, shocked, before she knocked him out with a swift punch to the jaw. Reed barely had time to react as another scavenger charged at him, swinging a crowbar. He ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding the blow. The scavenger swung again, but Reed was ready. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the crowbar dropped from his hand. Reed followed through with a punch to the stomach, sending the scavenger stumbling backward. But the man wasn't finished yet. He pulled a knife from his belt and lunged at Reed, slashing at him with wild desperation. Reed barely managed to dodge the first strike. His heart raced as he stepped back, looking for an opening. The scavenger was fast, but Reed's instincts kicked in. He waited for the man to swing again, then stepped to the side, grabbing the knife out of the air. In one swift motion, he drove the blade into the scavenger's side, just below the ribs. The man let out a strangled gasp before collapsing to the ground. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The remaining scavengers were on the floor, either unconscious or too injured to continue. Reed stood over them, his breath coming in short gasps. His body ached, and his heart was still racing, but the fight had been won. For now. Rena stood beside him, her expression unreadable. She had fought with a calm efficiency that Reed couldn't help but admire. He glanced at her, surprised by how easily she had moved through the chaos. "Nice work," he said, trying to catch his breath. Rena didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her eyes scanning the area, making sure there were no more threats. Reed didn't know what she was thinking, but he could tell that she wasn't done yet. There was still something on her mind, something bigger than the fight they had just won. "What now?" Reed asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. Rena looked at him, her eyes serious. "Now we keep moving. We don't have much time." Reed frowned. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the street, her gaze distant. "The ones who destroyed my people, they'll come for us. They'll come for Earth." Reed felt a chill run down his spine. The fight they had just won was nothing compared to what was coming. Reed and Rena stood amidst the broken bodies of the scavengers, the air thick with the smell of dust and blood. The fight had been quick, but it had left a heavy weight between them. Reed wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the darkened street. The immediate threat had passed, but he knew this was only the beginning. The scavengers were nothing compared to what was coming. Rena had been right. They had to keep moving. "We can't stay here," Reed said, his voice low and serious. He glanced around one more time, making sure there were no more enemies lurking in the shadows. "The rest of them will be back soon, looking for their people. We need to find a new place to hide, and fast." Rena nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at the street ahead of them told Reed that she was already thinking about what came next. The fight with the scavengers had been a warning, and it wasn't lost on either of them. Whoever or whatever was hunting Rena wasn't going to stop. And if the scavengers had been this determined, Reed could only imagine what kind of force they were up against. "Where do we go?" Reed asked, already moving toward the alleyway. "Any place you know." Rena hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice soft. "There's a place, not far from here. It's hidden. Safe." Reed raised an eyebrow. Hidden. Safe. It sounded too good to be true, but at this point, he didn't have many options. He had learned to trust his instincts, and something about Rena told him that she wasn't lying. She was the one who knew the real danger, after all. "Lead the way," Reed said. Rena moved with purpose, her movements quick and fluid. Reed followed closely behind, his senses alert as they navigated through the crumbling streets of Eldridge. The city was a maze of wreckage, broken buildings, and forgotten memories. It was the kind of place where anyone could disappear, and many had. But Reed wasn't just trying to disappear anymore. He was trying to survive, and help Rena do the same. As they walked, Reed couldn't help but wonder what kind of life Rena had led before all this. She had spoken briefly about her people being destroyed, but she hadn't said much else. Her past was a mystery, one that Reed wasn't sure he wanted to solve just yet. For now, all he needed to focus on was keeping them both alive. After what felt like hours of moving through dark alleys and empty streets, they finally reached a small, abandoned building. The structure was nothing special, a few walls still standing, some windows covered by boards, but it was hidden well enough to escape the notice of anyone looking for them. Rena stopped in front of the door and turned to Reed. "We're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Reed nodded, but something about the way she said it made him uneasy. This wasn't the time for rest, not when they were still being hunted, but he didn't question her. If she thought this place was safe, he would trust her. For now. They stepped inside, the door creaking as it swung open. The interior was dark, filled with the smell of damp wood and stale air. Reed's eyes adjusted to the low light, and he saw that the room was empty, except for a few pieces of old furniture and a dusty floor. It didn't look like much, but it would do. Rena moved toward the corner of the room, where a small trapdoor was hidden beneath a pile of debris. She crouched down, brushing away the dust, and revealing the entrance to an underground shelter. "Come," she said, lifting the trapdoor. "It's safer down there." Reed followed her without hesitation. As soon as he stepped inside, he felt the temperature drop. The underground room was small but well hidden. It was clear that Rena had made this place her temporary home before. There were blankets on the floor, a few supplies scattered about, and even some old food cans that looked like they had been used in the past. Reed took a deep breath and sat down on one of the blankets. He looked at Rena, who was standing near the entrance, her eyes distant. He could tell she was thinking, her mind working through whatever plan she had in mind. "You said they'll come for us," Reed said, breaking the silence. "Who exactly are they?" Rena's eyes flickered toward him, and she finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "They are called the Vornak, a species unlike anything you've ever seen. They don't care about life. They don't care about anything but their conquest. They are the ones who destroyed my people." Reed's eyes widened. He had heard rumors of alien invaders, of creatures from beyond the stars, but he had never expected to be facing something like this. The Vornak. It sounded like something out of a nightmare. "Why Earth?" Reed asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Why us?" Rena sighed, her gaze turning to the floor. "Earth is just one of many worlds they've conquered. They come for resources, for power. They don't care who they destroy along the way. My people were the last to stand in their way, but we lost. We couldn't stop them." Reed felt a chill crawl up his spine. The Vornak weren't just another alien race. They were a force of destruction, a tide of power that swept across planets without mercy. And now, they were after Rena. And if they found her, they would come for Earth next. "We can't let them win," Reed said, his voice determined. "But how do we fight something like that?" Rena turned to face him, her eyes fierce. "We don't fight alone. We fight together. There are others, people like me. We've been hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike back. If we can find them, we can stop the Vornak before they destroy everything." Reed wasn't sure how they would do it. He had no weapons, no training, and no idea where to start. But he knew one thing. If they didn't fight back, there would be no world left to save. "We'll find them," Reed said, his voice steady. "We'll find a way." Rena smiled, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. For the first time since they met, Reed saw something different in her. It wasn't fear. It was determination. Together, they would stand against the storm. The underground room felt colder now, the silence pressing in on Reed like a heavy weight. He couldn't stop thinking about the Vornak. Rena had said they were unstoppable, a force that had already wiped out her people. But there had to be something they could do. There had to be a way to fight back. He looked over at Rena, who was sitting across from him, her eyes distant as she stared at the wall. Her expression was grim, but Reed could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just planning for survival anymore. She was planning for a fight. "We can't let the Vornak destroy everything," Reed said, his voice firm. "But we can't do it alone. How do we find these others you mentioned?" Rena turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were hard, determined. "We find them by following the signs. They'll know I'm alive. They'll be looking for me." Reed raised an eyebrow. "So we just wait for them to find us?" She shook her head. "Not wait. We move. We start looking for them." Reed nodded, feeling a surge of determination. It felt like the only choice they had left. If the Vornak were coming for Earth, they couldn't afford to hide anymore. They needed to gather allies, build a resistance. If Rena had survived so far, there had to be others who could fight back too. People like her, people who understood what the Vornak were capable of. How do we start? Reed asked, standing up and stretching his sore muscles. First, Rena said, standing and grabbing a small tattered map from the corner of the room, we need to get to the old communication hub. It's not far from here. It used to be a place where we could contact others who were hiding. Reed nodded again. He didn't ask how she knew about it. He had learned not to question her instincts. If she said it was important, then it was. And once we get there, we send out a signal, Rena replied. If there's anyone left who can hear it, they'll come. If not, we'll have to find another way. Reed wasn't sure how many people would still be out there, hiding from the Vornak. But he had to trust Rena. She had already survived so much, and if anyone knew how to resist, it was her. They gathered their things quickly. Rena had a few supplies stored in the shelter, and Reed had what little he could carry, a small knife, a water bottle, and a few cans of food. There wasn't much else, but it would have to do. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Reed wasn't about to back down now. They made their way out of the shelter and into the streets. The city of Eldridge was still a ghost town, the buildings crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. But there was a strange quiet in the air now, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Reed kept his eyes sharp, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The scavengers might have been dealt with, but the Vornak were a different story. They weren't going to give up that easily. As they walked, Reed couldn't help but notice how at ease Rena seemed. She moved with a confidence he didn't fully understand, like she had lived in places far more dangerous than this. It was clear she had seen a lot, more than he could ever imagine. But there was something else there too, something softer. She didn't just want to survive. She wanted to fight back. The communication hub wasn't far. It was located on the edge of the city, hidden beneath layers of rubble and decaying infrastructure. It had once been a central hub for the people of Eldridge, a place where they could connect with the outside world. Now it was little more than a forgotten relic of a time before everything had fallen apart. When they reached the hub, Reed took a deep breath and glanced around. There was no sign of anyone. The building was eerily silent, the air heavy with dust. Rena led the way inside, moving cautiously as she checked every corner. Reed followed close behind, his hand resting on the knife at his side. The inside of the hub was just as abandoned as the rest of the city. Broken screens and scattered wires littered the floor, and the once pristine walls were now covered in grime and decay. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. But that didn't matter. They only needed to send the signal. Rena walked toward the central terminal, a large piece of old technology buried beneath layers of dust. She wiped it off carefully and began to work. Reed stood by the door, keeping watch, his senses alert for any signs of movement. The silence stretched on, making him uneasy. "Are you sure this will work?" Reed asked, his voice low. Rena didn't look up as she worked, her fingers flying over the worn-out controls. "It has to. If we can get the signal out, we'll be able to contact anyone who's still fighting back." Reed nodded, though a part of him wasn't so sure. What if there was no one left? What if they were too late? He didn't have an answer for that. All he knew was that they had to try. Finally, after what felt like hours, Rena looked up from the terminal. "It's done," she said, her voice steady, but still tinged with the weight of uncertainty. "The signal is out." Reed's heart skipped a beat. "You think someone will respond?" "We'll know soon enough," she said quietly. They both stood there, waiting in silence. Every second felt like an eternity as Reed's mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. They couldn't afford to fail. If no one responded, they would be alone in this fight. But if the signal reached the right people, maybe, just maybe, they would have a chance. And then, as if answering their unspoken prayers, a crackling voice came through the old damaged speakers. "This is Captain Vargas of the Earth Resistance. We received your signal. We're coming for you." Reed's breath caught in his throat. It was real. There were still people out there, still fighting. They weren't alone. Reyna turned to him, her eyes bright with hope. "It's beginning. The fight is starting." Reed nodded, feeling a surge of relief and determination. They had found their first ally. And with the resistance coming, the Vornak were about to learn that Earth wouldn't go down without a fight. Reed and Reyna stood frozen for a moment, the crackling voice from the terminal echoing in their minds. Captain Vargas. The Earth Resistance. It was real. They weren't alone. There was hope after all. The old communication hub, once silent and lifeless, now hummed with the weight of their next steps. Reed could hardly believe it, but Reyna's expression told him everything. She had been right all along. There were still others out there who had not given up. The Vornak had not wiped out all of humanity, and Earth had a chance to fight back. Reed turned to Reyna. "Did you hear that? They're really coming." Reyna's face softened, a rare smile breaking through her usually guarded expression. "I heard. It's the first step toward taking back what was lost." Reed nodded, a renewed sense of purpose flooding through him. They couldn't waste any more time. The resistance had responded, and that meant action. The Vornak were still out there, and if they didn't move quickly, their enemies would find them. They needed to stay ahead of them. "We should get ready," Reyna said, turning away from the terminal. "Captain Vargas will give us the plan, but we need to be prepared for anything." Reed agreed, his heart racing. He had never been part of something like this before. All he had ever known was survival, but now, with the resistance, he was part of something bigger. He had a purpose beyond just keeping himself alive. Together, they would take a stand. They quickly gathered what little gear they had left. The small knife Reed had, a few cans of food, and some water were all they could carry. But there was something else now. A message. A glimmer of hope that gave them both the strength to push forward. As they prepared to leave the communication hub, Reed glanced at Reyna. She had been through so much, and yet, she had never lost that fire. She had never given up. It was a quality he admired more than he could express. They were a team now, and there was no turning back. The streets of Eldridge were still eerily quiet. The city had been abandoned for so long, and now, with the Vornak's shadow hanging over it, it felt like the calm before a storm. Reed's eyes scanned the surroundings, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound made his muscles tense. But Reyna moved with a confidence that kept him grounded. "Where do we go next?" Reed asked as they moved through the deserted streets. "The resistance has set up a small base on the outskirts of the city," Reyna replied. "That's where we'll meet Captain Vargas. We need to be there before nightfall." Reed nodded. They couldn't afford to waste time. The resistance might be their best chance, but they still had to find them. As they walked, the weight of the situation sank in. They were about to face the Vornak, a race of invaders who had already decimated so many other worlds. Earth was next on their list, and if Reed and Reyna didn't act fast, it might be too late. The journey was tense, each step echoing in the silence of the ruined city. But finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they reached the outskirts of Eldridge. The Resistance's hidden base wasn't much to look at, just a few tents and makeshift barricades, but it was a sign that the fight had already begun. Reed's heart quickened as they approached, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything they had been through. Reyna moved quickly, scanning the area before she led Reed to a small tent near the center of the camp. Inside, they found Captain Vargas. He was a tall man with dark hair and a stern expression, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness, a knowing, that told Reed he had seen the worst the universe had to offer. Vargas didn't waste any time. "I'm glad you made it," Captain Vargas said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We've been tracking the Vornak for weeks. We know they're getting closer. But now we have a real chance to push back." Reed nodded, his mind racing. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. "What's the plan?" Reyna asked, her tone as serious as ever. Vargas didn't hesitate. He pulled up a map of the region on a small screen. "We've located one of the Vornak's primary supply routes. If we can take it out, we'll cripple their ability to resupply. It'll slow them down, give us a fighting chance. But we need to move fast. They'll have reinforcements coming in, and we can't afford to be caught." Reed felt a lump form in his throat. This was real. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were going to fight. But it was a dangerous mission, and not everyone would make it out alive. "We'll do it," Reed said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. "We have to." Reyna glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned back to Vargas. "When do we leave?" Vargas looked at them both, as if weighing their resolve. "We move out at dawn. Get some rest. You'll need it." Reed nodded, his mind still spinning. The plan was set. There was no turning back. But one thing was certain. They were no longer just survivors. They were part of the resistance, and they were about to make their stand against the Vornak. As Reed settled down in a corner of the camp, he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. They were about to face an army of invaders, an enemy that had already destroyed so much. But they had something the Vornak didn't: hope. And as long as they had that, they still had a chance. The fight was just beginning.